My name is Alwyn, and I am 26 years old. I knew something was wrong when the elegant string quartet at our charity gala began to sound distant and distorted. I had just lunged across the ballroom to swat a peanut-laced tart away from my 6-year-old niece, Flora, when the cross-contaminated dust swept directly into my face. My throat tightened almost instantly. I tried to take a deeper breath, but my chest felt locked, as if an invisible weight were pressing against it. I stumbled toward the VIP table and whispered, "I cannot breathe." Ralph glanced at me without putting down his champagne. "Get up!" he hissed. "The mayor is watching. Stop trying to ruin this." Aboli muttered that I was always searching for attention. Adina gave an uncomfortable laugh and went back to taking selfies. I tried to walk toward the exit, hoping for my emergency auto-injector, but my legs suddenly gave out. I crashed into a tray of crystal flutes, the shattering sound making the entire room turn. That was when Edina's new boyfriend pushed through the crowd, his expression changing to pure horror as he shouted, "Call 911, now!" For one long second, the gala went silent. Ralph and Aboli stood frozen, their faces pale, not out of fear for my life, but for their reputation. Before I tell you how they tried to hide me, and how that silence was the beginning of their multi-million-dollar empire coming apart, tell me what the weather is like where you are, whether it matches your mood today, and where you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The silence broke completely. The air in the ballroom had been thick with expensive perfume and roasted meats, but the air in the storage room tasted like stale floor wax and old cardboard. Ralph's hands were remarkably strong for a man who spent his days sitting comfortably in executive boardrooms. He gripped my upper arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin through the thin silk of my evening gown, and practically dragged me behind the heavy velvet curtains. Aboli followed closely behind, her designer heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. She was looking at her diamond watch, not at my rapidly changing face. My lips were already turning a faint shade of blue, and my hands clawed uselessly at my own throat. "Just put her in here until she catches her breath," Ralph muttered, shoving the heavy utility door open. He pushed me inside, and I stumbled against a tall stack of folded banquet chairs. The mayor is literally walking up to the podium right now. I am not having an ambulance siren ruin the biggest real estate announcement of my entire career. I tried to speak, to desperately beg them for my emergency auto-injector, but only a wet, raspy squeak escaped my lips. My lungs felt like they had been completely filled with wet cement. Aboli stood in the doorway, blocking the ambient light from the hallway. She looked down at me with an expression of profound, chilling annoyance. "You always do this." "Alwyn," Aboli hissed, expertly smoothing down the front of her tailored dress. "You always find a way to make everything about you. Just sit here quietly. Do not make a scene. I will send someone with a glass of water when the speeches are over." They were actually going to leave me in the dark. They were going to walk back out to the flashing cameras and the champagne toast while my airway swelled completely shut. My vision began to narrow rapidly, the edges of the tiny room tunneling into pure blackness. I slid down the wall, my knees hitting the cold linoleum floor. I thought only about Flora, praying she had not touched that toxic dessert. Suddenly, the heavy door flew open, violently hitting the wall. Leonard stood framed in the bright light, his tuxedo jacket discarded, his eyes scanning the dark room until they locked directly onto me. He did not ask for permission. He moved with the terrifying speed of a medical professional who knew exactly how many seconds were left on the clock. "What are you doing?" Ralph demanded, stepping aggressively into Leonard's path. "I told you, she just needs a minute. You are not calling emergency services to my event." Leonard did not even look at him. He shoved Ralph's shoulder hard enough to make the older man stumble backward, reaching into the medical kit he had somehow already procured from the hotel staff. Leonard pulled out a syringe. He jammed the epinephrine directly into my thigh through my dress. The sudden rush of the medication was like a physical blow, shocking my heart into a frantic, pounding rhythm. Leonard grabbed his phone with his free hand, dialing 911. "You are making a massive mistake, young man," Ralph threatened, his voice dropping to a low, venomous growl. Leonard kept his eyes completely focused on my slowly rising chest. "Get out of my way." He chose my life. The heavy metal doors of the ambulance slammed shut, completely severing me from the chaotic, glittering hum of the charity gala. Inside, the sterile scent of rubbing alcohol and medical-grade plastic replaced the suffocating aroma of the ballroom. The sudden quiet was incredibly jarring. The flashing red and white lights painted frantic shadows against the metal walls, but the atmosphere itself was strictly clinical and focused. I was lying flat on the stretcher, an oxygen mask strapped securely over my face, listening to the rhythmic, reassuring beep of the heart monitor tracking my survival. Leonard sat on the narrow bench directly beside me. He had not returned to the ballroom. He had not gone back to stand next to Adina for the society photographers or the local news crews. Instead, he was right here, watching the monitor closely, his posture rigid with a mixture of professional focus and sheer, unfiltered disbelief. He did not say a word, but the silent anger radiating from him was palpable in the small space. Not a single member of my family had stepped into the back of this ambulance. Ralph had stayed to shake hands with the mayor. Aboli had stayed to expertly manage the catering staff. Adina had stayed because leaving early would ruin her carefully curated social media timeline. I was completely alone, save for a man I had only briefly met twice before tonight. As the siren finally wailed to life, cutting sharply through the crisp night air of Lake Forest, my phone vibrated intensely against my hip. I had shoved it into the hidden pocket of my dress earlier in the evening. My fingers were still trembling violently from the adrenaline and the residual terror of suffocation, but I managed to pull the device out. The bright screen illuminated the dim space. It was a text message from Aboli. "Please tell me you are not making a massive scene at the hospital. Your father is about to close the waterfront development deal with the mayor tonight. We cannot afford any negative press right now. If anyone posts a video of you knocking over those glasses, delete it immediately. We will deal with your dramatics when we get home." I read the words slowly. I read them a second time, letting the syllables sink past my skin and settle deep into my bones. The cold oxygen flowed constantly over my dry lips, but the bitter chill inside my chest had absolutely nothing to do with the temperature of the air. There was no question asking if my airway was open. There was no inquiry about my heart rate. There was absolutely nothing resembling a mother's fear for her youngest child. She was solely concerned with optics, real estate zoning, and public relations. For 26 years, I had desperately convinced myself that their harshness was just a twisted form of high society tough love. I had believed that if I just worked harder, planned better events, and stayed quietly in the background, they would eventually see my value. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at a table where they never even bothered to set a plate for me. I stared at the glowing screen until the cruel words blurred together. I did not type a reassuring reply. I did not apologize for bleeding on their perfect evening. I simply pressed the power button, watching the screen go completely black. The vibration stopped. The illusion was gone. The emergency room was a symphony of controlled chaos, but my corner of it was a quiet, highly sterile bubble. The heavy dose of antihistamines and intravenous steroids had left my mind floating in a strange, thick fog. I lay on the stiff hospital bed, staring blankly at the acoustic ceiling tiles, while the rhythmic beeping of the machines measured out the passing hours. In that hazy space between waking and sleeping, my mind inevitably drifted back to the absolute foundation of my existence, the family's charitable foundation. On paper, Ralph and Aboli were the philanthropic kings of Chicago. They were the smiling faces on the glossy brochures, the prominent names printed in bold letters on the gala invitations, the visionaries who supposedly dedicated their privileged lives to community upliftment. But the reality behind the curtain was a grueling, unglamorous grind, and the entire weight of it rested squarely on my shoulders. I was their invisible backbone. I meticulously managed the logistics. I reconciled the endless vendor invoices. I handled the crisis communications, coordinated the volunteer schedules, and drafted every single grant proposal that kept the foundation's lights on. I worked 80 hours a week, hunched over a laptop in a windowless back office, fueled by lukewarm coffee and the desperate hope of a simple acknowledgement. I received zero salary. When I had once nervously asked Ralph for a modest stipend to cover my basic living expenses, he had scoffed loudly, telling me that family did not send invoices to family. My labor was an expectation, an unwritten tax I owed simply for existing in their orbit. As the medication pumped slowly through my veins, a specific, chilling memory surfaced from the very depths of my exhaustion. It was a memory I had routinely pushed aside because questioning it felt entirely too dangerous. It was the memory of the quarterly trust reports. Every 3 months, Ralph would stride purposefully into my tiny office, dropping a massive, disorganized stack of legal documents directly onto my keyboard. They were always related to the irrevocable trust established by my late grandmother. He would stand over me, tapping his expensive leather shoe against the floor, exuding intense impatience. "Just sign the beneficiary acknowledgments." "Alwyn," he would command, his voice leaving absolutely no room for debate. "It is just administrative garbage. My lawyers need it filed by 5 o'clock to keep the compliance auditors off my back. Don't waste time reading the boilerplate text." And I never did. I was always too busy putting out their fires, too exhausted from managing their empire, too terrified of triggering Ralph's legendary temper. I would blindly scrawl my signature on the dotted lines, handing the destiny of my own inheritance right back to the man who treated me like disposable staff. Lying in the hospital bed, the memory suddenly took on a sharp, horrifying clarity. The trust was not just an account. It was a secure fortress my grandmother had carefully built, and I had been willingly handing Ralph the keys to the heavy gates without ever looking inside the vault. What had I been signing away all these years? What numbers were hidden in those thick stacks of administrative garbage? The questions pulsed in my mind, far louder than the heart monitor. I had signed blindly. The harsh, fluorescent lights of the hospital room flickered to life, pulling me entirely out of my medicated sleep. Morning had broken outside, casting a pale, gray light across the spotless linoleum floor. My throat still felt incredibly raw, a painful reminder of the swelling that had nearly killed me. But my mind was startlingly clear. I turned my head slowly and found Dr. Leonard sitting quietly in a plastic chair near the open doorway. He was no longer wearing his tailored tuxedo jacket. His silk bow tie was gone, and his crisp white dress shirt was deeply wrinkled from spending the entire night in a waiting room chair. He looked up from the medical chart in his hands, his dark eyes meeting mine. There was no polite society smile on his face. He was not looking at me like his girlfriend's awkward, invisible younger sister. He was looking at me exactly like a survivor he had just pulled from a terrible wreckage. "Your airway is completely stable," Leonard said, his voice quiet but incredibly firm. "The steroids did their job perfectly. You're going to be fine physically." I nodded slowly, shifting slightly against the stiff hospital pillows. "Thank you for everything you did. You didn't have to stay here all night." Leonard closed the chart firmly and placed it on the small rolling table. "Flora is perfectly fine, by the way. I called the nanny this morning to check on her. She never touched the tart. She told the nanny that Aunt Alwyn slapped it out of her hands before she could take a bite." A heavy wave of profound relief washed over me. I closed my eyes for a brief second, immensely thankful that the 6-year-old was completely safe. Adina had absolutely no idea. Leonard continued, his tone turning dangerously cold. When I found her in the hotel lobby after the ambulance left, she was furious. Not scared, furious. She complained endlessly that you had made a dramatic exit and ruined the elegant mood of her VIP table. She didn't even know her own daughter had been handed a plate covered in peanut dust. I swallowed hard, the brutal truth stinging more than the medical tubes. Adina only cares about the aesthetic of the event. Details like potentially fatal ingredients are beneath her. Leonard leaned forward, resting his elbows heavily on his knees. He looked directly into my eyes, methodically stripping away years of my carefully constructed denial. Alwyn, I am an emergency room physician. I see panicked, terrified families every single day. I see parents sobbing in hallways, begging me to save their children. What I saw last night in that storage room was not panic. It was calculated, cold-blooded suppression. He paused intentionally, letting the heavy silence hang between us before delivering the final, devastating blow. Do they always treat you like disposable garbage? The question hit me with the sheer force of a physical strike. I opened my mouth to give my standard, practiced response. I desperately wanted to say that they meant well, that Ralph was just stressed about his massive real estate project, that Aboli was just overwhelmed with the gala logistics. I wanted to protect their image, because protecting their image was the only job I had ever known. But the words died completely in my throat. I looked at the empty chairs in my hospital room. No father, no mother, no sister. Just a stranger who had recognized my humanity when my own blood had aggressively ignored it. I finally saw them. The stark truth shining in Leonard's eyes forced me to finally look back at the jagged landscape of my childhood. The disparity had never been a guarded secret. It was practically a proudly displayed family crest. Adina was the golden child, a flawless reflection of Aboli's aggressive social ambitions and Ralph's demanding vanity. I was the silent workhorse, the quiet machinery hidden below deck, entirely expected to keep their luxurious ship moving forward without ever asking for a turn in the sunlight. I clearly remembered being 16, sitting at the massive kitchen island at 2 a.m, meticulously addressing 500 handwritten invitations for Ralph's corporate retreat. My fingers were tightly cramped and deeply stained with black ink. Meanwhile, Adina was upstairs packing a brand new designer suitcase for a fully sponsored ski trip to Aspen. When I had quietly mentioned that I was exhausted and had an important history exam the very next day, Ralph hadn't even looked up from his glowing iPad. He simply stated that a family's success requires sacrifice, conveniently leaving out that I was the only one ever expected to bleed for it. I remembered graduating from college with top honors in logistics and event management. There was no celebration dinner. There was no proud family photograph taken. Instead, Aboli handed me a massive, heavy binder detailing the upcoming charity gala, casually informing me that I would be taking over as the lead coordinator because their previous planner had quit. I had accepted the massive binder like a dutiful soldier, desperate to finally earn their genuine respect through my sheer competence. But the ultimate, undeniable proof of my worthlessness had materialized just 3 days before the gala. I had spent 6 months curating a perfectly safe, allergy-conscious menu for the event. I had documented every single ingredient, knowing my own severe peanut allergy, and knowing that little Flora shared my genetic vulnerability. I had explicitly briefed the catering director 3 separate times. Then, Adina had swept into the hotel kitchen for a final, unannounced tasting. She had taken one look at the carefully plated, perfectly safe desserts and loudly declared them visually boring. Without consulting me once, she aggressively demanded the chef switch to a hazelnut peanut tart simply because the crushed nuts perfectly matched the golden color scheme of the ballroom decorations. When I discovered the dangerous change the morning of the event, I had confronted Aboli in the hotel lobby. I was shaking, holding the updated menu in my hands. I told her the cross-contamination risk was far too high. I begged her to revert to the original plan, warning her that a severe allergic reaction was entirely possible. Aboli had merely adjusted her sparkling diamond necklace, looking at me with pure, unadulterated disdain. Stop being so incredibly dramatic. Alwyn, Edina has an exquisite eye for design, and those tarts look absolutely spectacular. Just carry your auto-injector and don't eat anything. It is not that difficult to accommodate your sister's artistic vision. My safety, my literal ability to draw breath, was considered a highly annoying obstacle to their aesthetic perfection. They had normalized my suffering to such a profound degree that my potential death was viewed as nothing more than a logistical inconvenience. My invisible labor was simply their birthright. I was their machine. Leonard eventually had to return to his hospital rotation, leaving me entirely alone with the rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor and the profound silence of the sterile room. Without the immediate distraction of his presence, my mind inevitably drifted backward, searching for a single anchor of genuine affection in the cold, transactional history of my family. There was only one person who had ever looked at me and seen a human being instead of a convenient administrative tool. My grandmother, Jacintha. She was the original architect of the family's charitable foundation. She had built the organization from the ground up, starting with local bake sales to fund community literacy programs. Decades before, Ralph and Aboli transformed it into a glittering high society networking club. Jacintha was a woman of sharp intellect and even sharper intuition. She saw completely through Ralph's manufactured charm and Aboli's desperate obsession with status. Most importantly, she saw exactly what they were doing to me. I clearly remembered a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I was 19. I had been sitting on the floor of Jacintha's grand, wood-paneled study, frantically organizing hundreds of silent auction donation receipts for Aboli's upcoming spring gala. I had skipped my college classes for 2 straight days just to meet the aggressive deadline my mother had casually tossed at me. My back ached terribly, and my eyes were burning from staring at the tiny print on the donor forms. Jacintha had slowly walked into the study, relying heavily on her ornate wooden cane. Her health was failing rapidly at that point, but her mind remained as incredibly sharp as polished glass. She stood over me for a long moment, watching my fingers fly across the calculator keypad. She did not praise my incredible work ethic. She did not thank me for saving the family's prestigious event. Instead, she gently tapped her cane against the edge of my spreadsheet. When I looked up, her expression was filled with a deep, sorrowful kind of anger. They are using your brilliant mind to build their hollow castles. Alwyn, Jacintha had said, her voice raspy but uncompromisingly firm. You think you are earning their love by carrying their heavy burdens? You are not. You are simply teaching them that your time, your energy, and your spirit have absolutely no financial or emotional value. I had tried to defend them, instinctively repeating the excuses Aboli had hardwired into my brain. I mumbled something about family duty and helping out during stressful seasons. Jacintha had reached down, her frail, trembling hand grasping my ink-stained fingers. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She forced me to stop typing and look directly into her eyes. Listen to me very carefully, child. Kindness without boundaries is just an invitation for exploitation. You have a beautiful, capable heart. Do not ever let them turn you into a stepping stone. At 19, I had been too terrified of losing my parents' fragile approval to fully comprehend the gravity of her words. I had just smiled politely, squeezed her hand, and gone right back to calculating their charitable donations. Lying in the hospital bed, the memory of her warning finally clicked perfectly into place. I finally understood her. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the harsh sunlight was streaming directly through the hospital blinds, illuminating the sterile white blankets covering my legs. My throat still felt incredibly tight, a lingering, painful reminder of the severe swelling from the anaphylaxis. The injection site on my thigh throbbed with a deep, dull ache. I was physically battered, mentally exhausted, and desperately hoping for a moment of quiet recovery. Then, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. It was not a phone call. It was a rapid, aggressive succession of text messages. For a brief, foolish second, the lingering remnants of my childhood conditioning made me hope that Ralph or Aboli had finally experienced a moment of parental guilt. I thought they might be asking if I was breathing properly, or if the doctors had cleared me to eat solid food. I picked up the device. The first message was from Ralph. The florist for the VIP after-party is threatening to pull the arrangements because the final invoice was not wired yesterday. You were supposed to handle this before the gala started. Fix it immediately. The mayor's chief of staff is asking questions about the ambulance. Draft a press release saying it was a minor fainting spell due to exhaustion. Have it on my desk by noon. There was absolutely no greeting. There was no inquiry about my survival. He had simply bypassed the fact that I had nearly suffocated to death in a dark storage room and went straight to demanding unpaid administrative labor. Before I could even process the sheer audacity of his message, another text popped up. This one was from Adina. You completely ruined the aesthetic of the main ballroom. I had to spend 40 minutes convincing the photographers not to publish pictures of you knocking over the champagne tower. People are texting me, asking if you had a mental breakdown. Log into your social media right now and post a story saying you just had low blood sugar from your stupid crash diet. You owe me for saving face. I stared at the glowing screen, my thumb hovering silently over the keyboard. My pulse began to elevate, making the heart monitor beside my bed beep at a slightly faster, more anxious rhythm. The physical contrast was incredibly stark. I was lying in a hospital gown, connected to intravenous fluids, recovering from a life-threatening medical emergency. They were sitting in their luxurious dining room, drinking expensive coffee, furious that my near-death experience had caused a minor public relations hiccup. They did not see me as a daughter or a sister. They saw me entirely as a malfunctioning piece of software that was currently failing to run their daily operations. If I died, their primary concern would realistically be how quickly they could hire a replacement event coordinator to handle the funeral logistics. The anger that had been carefully suppressed for 26 years finally began to rise. It was not a hot, screaming, chaotic anger. It was a cold, incredibly clear, terrifyingly calm realization of my own objective reality. They felt absolutely no shame. Shortly after the barrage of demanding text messages, a gentle knock sounded at my door. A woman with kind eyes, holding a standard clipboard, stepped quietly into the room. She introduced herself as Dr. Foster, the hospital's clinical psychologist assigned to follow up with patients who had experienced severe, life-threatening traumas in the emergency department. She pulled up a chair, her posture relaxed and entirely unthreatening. She asked standard questions about my breathing, my anxiety levels, and my sleep quality. Then, she glanced around the perfectly empty hospital room. There were no flowers. There were no balloons. There were no anxious family members pacing the hallway outside. "Is there anyone we should call for you?" "Alwyn Drive," Foster asked gently. "Someone to sit with you while you recover." The automatic, deeply conditioned response instantly rose to my lips. "No, it's fine. My parents are just incredibly busy today. My father is closing a massive real estate project with the mayor, and my mother runs a major charity. They have a lot of important people depending on them." "Doctor." Foster did not write anything on her clipboard. She simply looked at me, tilting her head slightly. "They are too busy to visit their daughter after an anaphylactic shock." I shifted uncomfortably against the stiff pillows, feeling a strange, desperate need to defend my abusers. I am their logistics coordinator. I usually handle all the crises. They rely heavily on me to keep things running smoothly. This is just a bad time for me to be unavailable. "Doctor!" Foster sighed softly, a sound filled with professional recognition and deep empathy. "Alwyn, are you familiar with the concept of learned helplessness?" I shook my head slowly, gripping the edge of the blanket. When an animal is repeatedly subjected to an inescapable, painful situation, it eventually stops trying to avoid the pain, even when an opportunity to escape is finally presented. Doctor, Foster explained, her voice steady and calm. In human relationships, especially within toxic family dynamics, we call it the trap of normalization. When you are systematically exploited and emotionally neglected from a very young age, your brain attempts to survive the trauma by convincing you that the abuse is completely normal. She leaned slightly closer, making sure I heard every single word. You have been trained to mistake their exploitation for love. You believe that your exhaustion is the currency required to buy their affection. But love does not require you to sacrifice your basic physical safety for someone else's public relations. I stared at the blank wall behind her. The psychological terminology perfectly articulated the invisible prison I had lived inside my entire life. I had always believed that if I just proved my usefulness, I would finally earn my humanity in their eyes. But utility and humanity are completely different things. They did not want a daughter. They wanted a flawless, silent machine. Doctor. Foster's words systematically dismantled the complex architecture of my lifelong denial. The crippling guilt I had always felt for never being good enough for Ralph and Aboli instantly evaporated, completely replaced by a profound, clarifying clarity. The heavy chains finally snapped. As Dr. Foster quietly exited the hospital room, leaving behind a profound psychological awakening, my phone vibrated one more time. The screen lit up with another demand, this time marked with urgent priority punctuation. It was Ralph again, escalating his threats because I had not responded to his earlier commands regarding the florist and the press release. If the mayor pulls out of this waterfront development deal because of your little dramatic stunt last night, you are personally paying for the financial damages. Stop ignoring me and fix the press release right now. Do not make me come down to that hospital. There it was. The ultimate, unapologetic weaponization of my existence. He was aggressively threatening to hold me financially liable for his own public relations problem, completely ignoring the fact that his wife and daughter had literally locked me in a dark storage room while my throat closed. In the past, a message like this would have sent me into a full-blown panic attack. I would have instantly ripped the intravenous needle from my own arm, booted up my laptop, and frantically drafted a flawless, self-deprecating press release to protect his fragile ego. I would have drained my own meager savings to pay his wealthy florist, terrified of his towering rage. Today, my heart rate did not spike. My hands did not shake. The cold, absolute clarity that had settled over me during my conversation with Dr. Foster remained completely undisturbed. I looked at the aggressive block of text on the screen, seeing it not as a terrifying command from a powerful patriarch, but as a pathetic, desperate grasp for control from a profoundly selfish man. I tapped the reply field. I did not type a lengthy, emotional explanation. I did not demand an apology for the storage room, nor did I express my deep hurt over their absence. I did not give them the satisfaction of a dramatic, hysterical reaction that they could easily dismiss as mental instability. I typed exactly one word. No. I hit send. Then, moving with deliberate, unhurried precision, I pressed the power button on the side of the device and held it down until the screen faded to absolute black. I tossed the dead phone onto the bedside table. I pressed the call button for the nursing station. When the attending nurse arrived, looking slightly concerned by my sudden request, I calmly asked for the against medical advice discharge paperwork. She tried to suggest that I stay for another round of observation, but my voice remained polite and completely immovable. I signed the necessary legal forms with a steady hand. I carefully removed the scratchy hospital gown, dressing myself in the wrinkled, elegant evening gown from the night before. It still smelled faintly of the gala. I gathered my small belongings, thanked the nursing staff for saving my life, and walked quietly down the sterile hallway toward the main exit. I did not look back, and I did not ask for a ride. I walked out the door. My apartment was located in a modest, quiet building on the north side of the city, completely removed from the sprawling, gated estates of Lake Forest. It was small, meticulously organized, and entirely mine. When I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, the profound silence of the space wrapped around me like a heavy, protective blanket. There were no massive floral arrangements waiting to be aggressively critiqued by a bully. There were no glowing server racks humming in the corner, processing Ralph's endless real estate data. There were only my thriving potted pothos plants lined up against the windowsill, catching the bright midday sun, and the soft, distant hum of the city traffic rolling past outside. I walked slowly into the small kitchen, my body still aching from the severe medical trauma, and methodically prepared a cup of chamomile tea. I stood by the kitchen counter, watching the steam curl lazily upward. For the first time in 10 years, I was not simultaneously checking 3 different email inboxes, coordinating catering schedules, or drafting apologetic emails to difficult vendors. I had officially initiated a complete and total blackout. By simply turning off my cell phone and refusing to open my laptop, I had effectively decapitated the entire operational structure of the family's charitable foundation. I knew exactly how fragile their polished empire truly was. I was the master administrator on every single digital account. I held the encryption keys for the donor databases, the passwords for the corporate bank portals, and the direct contact lines for every major political sponsor in the city. Ralph and Aboli had spent their entire lives projecting an image of effortless, elite competence. But the undeniable truth was that they could not successfully organize a neighborhood bake sale without my invisible labor holding the structural framework together. They had built a massive, glittering stage, but I was the only person who knew how to operate the complicated lighting rig. As I sipped the hot tea, feeling the soothing liquid ease the lingering soreness in my throat, I visualized the absolute chaos that was undoubtedly unfolding across town. Without my constant, frantic intervention, emails were currently bouncing back. Invoices were hitting critical past-due markers. Important socialites were leaving angry voicemails that nobody else knew how to politely manage. They had always treated me as if I was completely expendable, an insignificant accessory to their grand, important lives. They had confidently assumed that my silence meant submission, and that my endless labor was a permanently guaranteed resource. They were about to discover the catastrophic difference between someone who is genuinely powerless and someone who simply decides to stop keeping the power grid online. I placed the empty ceramic mug gently into the stainless steel sink, feeling a deep, abiding sense of peace settle over my tired bones. I did not feel a single drop of guilt. I let the empire burn. I would only learn about the sheer magnitude of the ensuing chaos weeks later. When Leonard and I finally sat down for coffee, he painted a perfectly vivid picture of a glittering empire actively tearing itself apart at the seams. While I was sitting quietly in my apartment watching the sunlight shift across my kitchen floor, Ralph and Aboli were discovering exactly what happens when the invisible engine driving their entire lives suddenly completely stops working. The morning after my quiet hospital departure, the fallout began to aggressively materialize. Aboli had confidently marched into her luxurious home office, intending to quickly pay the final invoices for the disastrous charity gala. She sat at her mahogany desk, opened the foundation's primary banking portal, and confidently typed in her usual password. Access denied. She tried a second time, then a third, her manicured fingers stabbing angrily at the keyboard. She did not realize that the master administrative access was permanently tethered to my personal security authenticators. I had not maliciously changed the passwords. The system simply required two-factor verification that only my disconnected phone could provide. In a matter of hours, the major vendors began sending increasingly hostile emails. The exclusive catering company, the luxury floral designers, and the elite venue coordinators all demanded their immediate payments, completely freezing the foundation's credit accounts. Meanwhile, Ralph was experiencing his own personalized version of a professional nightmare. The mayor, who had been heavily banking on the positive public relations of the gala, had instead spent his morning fielding urgent questions from local journalists. The media had caught wind of a serious medical emergency involving the foundation's own family members being aggressively swept under the rug. The mayor's chief of staff formally requested a massive delay on the waterfront development project, citing concerns over Ralph's volatile public image. Adina was not spared from the structural collapse. She spent the entire morning crying hysterically in her bedroom because two major lifestyle brands had abruptly canceled their lucrative social media sponsorships. The brands had requested simple, standard metric reports from her recent campaigns. Adina had absolutely no idea how to pull those analytics because I was the one who always generated, formatted, and emailed her professional media kits. They were all frantically trying to call my phone, completely unaware that it was sitting dark and useless in a drawer. They were rapidly discovering that their highly curated, deeply impressive lives were entirely built on a foundation of my constant, uncompensated labor. They had spent years aggressively demanding that I stay quietly in the background, treating my contributions as a basic, expected utility. Now, the utility had been permanently shut off, and they were completely incapable of paying the massive bill required to turn it back on. The silence I had created was not just a personal boundary. It was a total structural collapse of their reality. The foundation was crumbling. It took them exactly 48 hours to transition from panicked confusion to absolute, unadulterated fury. On the morning of the third day, the sharp, persistent buzzing of my apartment's building intercom shattered the peaceful quiet of my living room. I already knew exactly who was standing down in the lobby. I walked slowly over to the security monitor mounted on the wall. The small, grainy black and white screen displayed Ralph and Aboli standing stiffly by the main glass doors. Ralph was clutching a thick leather portfolio tightly against his chest, his jaw set in a rigid line of barely contained anger. Aboli was glaring impatiently up at the security camera, her designer sunglasses pushed back perfectly on her head. They had not come to my home to apologize. They had not driven across the city to ask if I was still experiencing chest pain or to see if my airway was fully healed. They had come explicitly to collect their passwords and forcibly drag their free administrative labor back to the office. The old Alwyn, the terrified girl desperate for their basic approval, would have instantly pressed the unlock button to avoid a messy public scene. She would have opened her apartment door, apologized profusely for causing an inconvenience, and immediately signed whatever documents Ralph had shoved in her face. I pressed the two-way communication button. Yes. Alwyn, let us up right now, Ralph commanded, his voice distorted but heavily laced with his usual dominating authority. This ridiculous little tantrum has gone on long enough. You have locked us out of the Foundation servers, and the vendors are threatening legal action. I have a stack of transition documents you need to sign immediately. I looked at his demanding face on the small monitor. My heart rate remained incredibly steady. You do not have an invitation to be here. Aboli leaned closer to the microphone panel, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. Do not act like a petulant child, Alwyn. We are your parents. Open this door before you completely destroy this family's reputation. I am not opening the door, I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotional fluctuation. I will no longer provide any uncompensated labor, digital access, or crisis management for your organization. You have the official corporate contact numbers for the software providers. They can assist you with an account recovery process. You listen to me, Ralph shouted, his composure finally slipping as he hit the glass door with the flat of his hand. You cannot just walk away from your responsibilities. You owe this family. I owe you absolutely nothing. I replied. Any further communication regarding the Foundation must be sent formally through email. Do not come to my home again. I released the intercom button. instantly cutting off his furious response. I stood quietly and watched the screen. Ralph continued yelling silently at the camera for 2 full minutes before the building superintendent politely asked them to step away from the entrance. They had to turn around and walk back to their luxury car, completely empty-handed. They could not touch me. When aggressive intimidation at my front door completely failed to produce the desired passwords, Ebola immediately pivoted to her most comfortable and deadly weapon, public manipulation. If she could not privately force me into submission, she would systematically destroy my credibility so that my eventual defection would look like the tragic actions of an unstable mind. Late that evening, my friend Leah sent me a frantic text message containing a direct link to the Foundation's official social media page. Ebola had drafted a lengthy, beautifully orchestrated post, complete with a somber, black-and-white photograph of the charity's headquarters. She didn't write as a furious employer demanding server access. She wrote performing the role of a deeply heartbroken, long-suffering mother, valiantly trying to hold her family together during a terrible crisis. It is with a heavy heart that Ralph and I must briefly address the unfortunate rumors circulating regarding our recent gala. The post began. Our youngest daughter, Alwyn, is currently battling a very sudden and severe mental health crisis. Her sudden departure from the event was a manifestation of a deep psychological breakdown, one that we have been privately trying to manage for years. She has currently isolated herself from our loving support. Please keep our family in your prayers as we step in to carry her heavy workload and protect her from her own erratic decisions. It was a brilliant, terrifyingly effective piece of character assassination. She had seamlessly taken the horrifying reality of my anaphylactic shock and completely repackaged it as a hysterical, psychiatric episode. By publicly claiming I was mentally unstable, she was proactively discrediting anything I might say about the storage room, the neglect, or the years of financial exploitation. I scrolled slowly through the comment section. It was flooded with hundreds of messages from wealthy socialites, local politicians, and community leaders. They were universally praising Eboli's incredible maternal strength. They offered their deepest sympathies to Ralph for having to deal with such a difficult, ungrateful daughter while managing a multi-million-dollar charity. Edina had even commented, adding a simple, tragic heart emoji to cement the narrative of a grieving sister. For a brief moment, the sheer injustice of it made my chest tighten. They were aggressively rewriting the narrative of my near-death experience, using my literal suffocation as convenient collateral to polish their own halos. They were banking entirely on my lifelong habit of remaining perfectly silent. But as I read through the paragraphs of manufactured sympathy, the lingering pain completely vanished, leaving behind a cold, calculating focus. Ebola thought she was playing a brilliant game of public relations chess. She did not realize she was just loudly announcing her moves while I was quietly holding the only key to the actual vault. I closed the browser tab. I did not draft a desperate, emotional response on my personal social media accounts. I did not record a tearful video attempting to convince the wealthy citizens of Lake Forest that my mother was a pathological liar. Fighting an aggressive smear campaign with pure emotion is exactly what a supposedly unstable person would do. I needed something far heavier than my own words. I needed an undeniable, objective paper trail. I sat down at my small kitchen table, opened my encrypted personal laptop, and slowly cracked my knuckles. I was no longer the frightened, accommodating logistics coordinator trying to keep the peace. I was a highly trained systems administrator walking back into a digital environment I had personally built from the ground up. I bypassed the basic user portals entirely and established a secure, remote connection directly to the Foundation's primary accounting servers. Ralph and Ebola had absolutely no idea how their own digital infrastructure functioned. They had always relied entirely on me to maintain the complicated cloud storage systems. Because my administrative privileges had never been formally revoked, I walked right through the digital front door completely undetected. My target was not recent emails or simple vendor disputes. I was looking specifically for the historical financial architecture. I remembered those heavy, disorganized stacks of legal documents Ralph used to drop aggressively onto my desk every quarter. I navigated deep into the encrypted legal directories, searching for the core files related to my grandmother's estate. I initiated a massive, secure download, 10 entire years of detailed transaction logs, quarterly audits, encrypted bank transfers, and original trust formation documents began flowing steadily into an isolated, protected folder on my hard drive. The progress bar crept slowly across the screen, a quiet, methodical countdown measuring the exact remaining lifespan of their carefully curated empire. While Aboli was busy responding to sympathetic comments on her manufactured tragedy post, I was meticulously organizing gigabytes of raw, unfiltered truth. I categorized the files by fiscal year, separating the general charity expenditures from the highly restricted trust allocations. I worked completely in silence, my mind incredibly sharp, fueled solely by the cold satisfaction of unearthing their deepest, most heavily guarded secrets. Tell me honestly, if you were watching your own family aggressively attempt to destroy your public reputation to save their own, would you waste your energy screaming into the void? Or would you quietly gather the evidence to dismantle their entire reality? I chose the evidence. The download complete notification pinged softly in the quiet apartment. I opened the oldest folder in the directory, labeled simply as Jacintha_original_formation_docs. I began to read. The digital documents illuminated the dark kitchen, casting a harsh blue light across my face as I read through the dense, complicated legal terminology. I opened the scanned PDF of the original irrevocable trust, established by my grandmother, Jacintha, exactly 12 years ago. I had always assumed the document simply transferred a block of standard corporate assets to my parents for the foundation's general use. I had been entirely wrong. Jacintha had not trusted Ralph and Aboli with her wealth. She had seen their vanity, their reckless spending habits, and their deep, inherent selfishness. The trust was not a gift to them. It was a highly restrictive financial cage designed explicitly to protect the money from their greed. The documents clearly stated that Ralph and Aboli were merely appointed as the acting fiduciary trustees. They did not own the capital. The sole, primary beneficiary of the multi-million-dollar trust was me. The foundation's operations were legally mandated to be funded solely by the generated interest, leaving the massive principal amount entirely untouched and legally designated for my future. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs as I opened the corresponding financial audit logs from the past 5 years. The numbers did not align, not even slightly. I cross-referenced the foundation's outgoing wire transfers against the public records of Ralph's real estate holding company. The pattern was incredibly obvious and devastatingly illegal. Ralph had been systematically funneling massive amounts of the restricted trust capital directly into his struggling commercial development projects, disguising the illegal transfers as anonymous charitable grants and community development initiatives. He had literally stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charity to desperately artificially inflate his own failing business empire. Aboli had co-signed every single fraudulent transfer. They had committed massive, systematic financial fraud, and they had been using my blind, exhausted signature on the quarterly administrative reports to completely cover their tracks. But Jacintha had been a brilliant, profoundly cautious woman. As I scrolled down to the final pages of the original trust agreement, I found a deeply buried, heavily bolded section labeled Beneficiary Protection Clause. The legal text was incredibly specific. It stated that if the acting trustees were ever found to be in gross violation of their fiduciary duties, or if they demonstrated a pattern of behavior that directly threatened the physical or moral well-being of the primary beneficiary, their status as trustees would be immediately and permanently revoked. Total control of the assets would automatically default to the beneficiary, provided she was over the age of 25. I was 26 years old. I had survived a life-threatening anaphylactic shock caused by their gross, calculated negligence. I held the absolute, undeniable proof of their massive financial embezzlement. My grandmother had not just left me an inheritance. She had carefully designed a legal guillotine, and she had waited patiently for the exact right moment for the blade to drop. I held the weapon. The following morning, I took a quiet taxi ride to the downtown financial district, carrying a secure flash drive containing 10 years of encrypted truth. I bypassed the massive, glittering corporate law firms and walked into a modest, oak-paneled office located on the third floor of an older brick building. The brass nameplate on the door read, Garrick, Attorney at Law, Mr. Garrick was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 60s. More importantly, he had been my grandmother Jacintha's personal attorney and oldest confidant before her passing. He offered me a cup of black tea and listened in absolute silence as I calmly explained the storage room incident, the aggressive smear campaign on social media, and the financial anomalies I had discovered on the Foundation's private servers. I handed him the flash drive. He spent the next 45 minutes carefully reviewing the digital archives, his expression growing increasingly grim with every spreadsheet he opened. When he finally took off his reading glasses, he looked at me with the exact same sorrowful anger my grandmother had shown me years ago. Alwyn, what they have done is not just deeply immoral, Mr. Garrick explained, his voice carrying the heavy, comforting weight of absolute legal certainty. It is a catastrophic violation of their fiduciary duty. He turned his computer monitor so I could see the highlighted text of the original trust document. A fiduciary duty is the highest standard of care in equity and law. As trustees, Ralph and Aboli were legally mandated to manage these funds exclusively for your benefit and the stated charitable purposes. Instead, they used your inheritance as a slush fund to illegally inflate Ralph's commercial real estate ventures. That is blatant embezzlement. I traced the rim of my teacup, absorbing the sheer magnitude of their deception. Ralph always told me the trust was just a corporate tax shield for the Foundation. He lied to keep you compliant, Mr. Garrick said flatly. But Jacintha anticipated their greed. Let us look at Section 4, the Beneficiary Protection Clause. He pointed to a densely worded paragraph. This safety clause states that if the acting trustees engage in financial misconduct, or if their actions pose a direct, demonstrable threat to the physical safety of the primary beneficiary, their legal authority is immediately terminated. Total control of the principal assets reverts entirely to you. My breath caught in my throat. A direct threat to my physical safety. Like locking me in a storage room during severe anaphylactic shock to protect a real estate speech. Exactly like that, Mr. Garrick confirmed, a small, razor-sharp smile appearing on his face. If we can definitively prove their negligence regarding your medical emergency, combined with this massive financial fraud, we do not just remove them from the Foundation. We dismantle their entire financial structure. They will have absolutely no legal standing to fight you. For 26 years, I had been completely trapped in a world where my parents' emotional manipulation and aggressive shouting dictated reality. But sitting in that quiet office, I realized something profoundly liberating. The law does not care about Aboli's fake tears or Ralph's terrifying temper. The law only cares about signed documents, verifiable timelines, and objective evidence. I didn't need to scream to be heard. I just needed the right paperwork. The law was my weapon. I spent the next 48 hours transforming from a terrified daughter into a meticulous, unfeeling architect of accountability. I did not shed a single tear. I did not draft any angry, emotional text messages to my sister. I treated the destruction of my family's abusive empire with the exact same hyper-focused, logistical precision I had always used to plan their extravagant charity galas. My first phone call was to Dr. Leonard. He answered immediately, completely unsurprised by my request. Within 2 hours, He securely emailed me a certified copy of his emergency medical report from the night of the gala. The clinical language was devastatingly clear. It detailed my rapidly closing airway, the critical administration of epinephrine, and the undeniable fact that any further delay in treatment would have resulted in permanent injury or death. My second task was slightly more complicated, but entirely within my specific skill set. Because I had personally negotiated the security contracts for the Lake Forest Hotel where the gala was held, I still possessed emergency vendor access to their digital portal. I logged into the system and submitted a formal, time-stamped request for the security camera footage covering the backstage hallway. When the video file arrived, I watched it in complete silence. The high-definition, soundless footage showed Ralph aggressively gripping my arm, dragging my stumbling, suffocating body down the corridor. It clearly showed Aboli checking her diamond watch, looking highly annoyed, before Ralph shoved me into the dark utility closet and firmly shut the heavy door. It was cold, objective, and absolutely undeniable proof of their calculated cruelty. I took the medical reports, the security footage stills on a USB drive, the 10 years of fraudulent financial audits, and the original copy of Jacintha's irrevocable trust, and I went to a local print shop. I systematically assembled 4 identical, thick black binders. Each page was perfectly tabbed and indexed. There was no room for emotional interpretation. There was only the brutal, systematic math of their own terrible choices. As I snapped the final binder shut, I felt a strange, cold sense of anticipation settling deep into my chest. For my entire life, I had been the one scrambling to clean up their messes, terrified of what would happen if the world ever saw their true colors. Now, I was the one holding the spotlight, firmly preparing to turn it directly onto their darkest secrets. Tell me honestly, if you finally held the ironclad, undeniable proof of your abuser's cruelty in your hands, would you quietly walk away to keep the peace? Or would you finally force them to read every single page I chose to make them read? I picked up my new, prepaid cell phone and drafted a brief, formal email to the Foundation's board of directors, copying Ralph, Abolai, Edina, and the mayor. I requested an emergency, mandatory board meeting the following afternoon to discuss critical financial discrepancies. The trap was fully set. The Foundation's executive boardroom was located on the top floor of a sleek glass high-rise downtown, a space deliberately designed to intimidate. It featured a massive mahogany table, panoramic views of the Chicago skyline, and leather chairs that cost more than a standard car. I arrived 20 minutes early, dressed in a sharp, tailored black suit that Aboli had once criticized as being entirely too severe. I arranged the 4 black binders neatly on the polished table. Mr. Garrick sat calmly in the chair directly to my right, unpacking his legal notepad. I sat at the far end of the long table, my hands folded perfectly still in my lap, waiting. At exactly 2 o'clock, the heavy glass doors swung open. Ralph entered first, exuding his usual, suffocating arrogance. Abole followed, wearing a designer dress and a deeply condescending smile. Edina trailed behind them, aggressively typing on her phone, looking incredibly bored by the entire proceeding. The mayor of Chicago arrived last, accompanied by his nervous-looking chief of staff. Ralph did not even bother to sit down. He stood near the head of the table, resting his knuckles on the mahogany wood, and looked at me as if I were a disobedient toddler throwing a tantrum in a public restaurant. I am incredibly busy today. Alwyn, Ralph announced, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. I am assuming you called this ridiculous meeting to formally apologize to the mayor for your little psychological episode, and to hand over the master passwords you childishly locked us out of. Make it quick. We have real work to do. Aboli let out a soft, theatrical sigh, looking sympathetically at the mayor. Please forgive her. As I mentioned online, Alwyn has been struggling with her mental stability. We are trying to get her the psychiatric help she so desperately needs. Adina finally looked up from her phone, rolling her eyes visibly. Seriously, Alwyn, just give them the password so I can get my sponsors back. You are ruining my engagement metrics. They were so profoundly confident in their own fabricated narrative. They genuinely believed I had summoned the most powerful men in the city simply to surrender and beg for their forgiveness. They thought they still held all the cards, entirely unaware that the game they were playing had completely ended the moment I walked out of that hospital. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch under Ralph's intimidating glare. I looked directly at the mayor, whose political career was currently tied directly to Ralph's financial reputation, and then I slowly shifted my gaze back to my father. I am not here to apologize. Ralph, I said, my voice as calm and steady as a ticking clock. And I am not experiencing a mental health crisis. I am here to execute a formal change of executive leadership. I slid the first black binder across the smooth table, pushing it directly into the center where everyone could see it. I opened the cover. The heavy silence in the boardroom was incredibly dense, broken only by the soft rustle of high-quality paper as the mayor's chief of staff curiously opened the black binder. Ralph frowned, his arrogant posture faltering slightly as he realized this was not a simple surrender. Tab 1, I instructed, my voice entirely devoid of any dramatic emotion. I was not speaking as a wounded daughter. I was speaking as an auditor presenting a final report. You will find a certified emergency medical assessment signed by Dr. Leonard Monroe. It details the severe, life-threatening anaphylactic shock I suffered at the charity gala last week. Aboli's face tightened instantly. Alwyn, this is hardly the time or place to discuss your dietary restrictions. Tab 2. I continued, cleanly cutting her off with icy precision. You will find 6 high-definition still frames pulled directly from the hotel's security cameras. The timestamps perfectly match the timeline of my medical emergency. The mayor slowly turned the page. The color completely drained from his face as he stared at the glossy photographs. He was looking at crystal-clear, undeniable images of Ralph forcefully dragging my collapsing, suffocating body down a backstage hallway. He saw Aboli standing by the utility closet, checking her watch with a look of supreme annoyance as I was shoved into the darkness. As the medical report clearly states, I was literally minutes away from complete respiratory failure. I narrated, watching Ralph's confident facade begin to rapidly splinter. My airway was aggressively closing. Instead of dialing 911, Ralph and Aboli Langford locked me inside a dark storage room and strictly forbade the hotel staff from calling an ambulance. They made a calculated decision to risk my actual death to ensure the sirens did not interrupt the mayor's real estate announcement. Adina dropped her phone onto the table, her mouth falling slightly open as she stared at the photographs. For all her shallow selfishness, even she seemed genuinely shocked by the sheer, mechanical cruelty displayed in the images. This is highly manipulated nonsense, Ralph finally roared, slamming his fist violently onto the mahogany table. He pointed a trembling finger directly at me. She is a deeply disturbed, ungrateful liar. She is trying to extort us because we finally stopped catering to her endless anxiety attacks. I did not flinch at the loud noise. I simply looked at the mayor, who was currently staring at Ralph with a mixture of profound disgust and rising political panic. The mayor was a seasoned politician. He immediately recognized the catastrophic optics of being directly associated with a family that would gladly let their own daughter suffocate in a closet to secure a zoning permit. The video file has been officially authenticated. Mr. Garrick spoke up for the first time, his calm, authoritative legal tone anchoring the room. It is legally admissible evidence of gross negligence and potential involuntary manslaughter. The facts are not up for debate, Mr. Langford. Ralph's face turned an ugly, mottled shade of crimson. He was accustomed to screaming until people surrendered. He had absolutely no idea how to fight against quiet, objective proof. The silence was incredibly deafening. Realizing that his aggressive intimidation tactics were completely failing, Ralph immediately pivoted to full-blown chaotic defense. The polished, elite patriarch vanished, rapidly replaced by a cornered, desperate narcissist watching his carefully constructed reality shatter in real time. "You listen to me," Ralph bellowed, turning his aggressive focus directly onto the mayor. "You know exactly how these hysterical girls are. She is deeply jealous of her sister. She has spent her entire life trying to sabotage this family. If you actually believe these fabricated, out-of-context photos over a man who has poured millions into your city's infrastructure, you are making a catastrophic mistake." Aboli instantly recognized the shifting tide and deployed her most reliable weapon. She buried her face in her manicured hands and began to sob loudly, her shoulders shaking with manufactured grief. "We were just trying to protect her," she cried out, looking pleadingly at the chief of staff. "She was having a severe panic attack. She always hyperventilates when she doesn't get her way. We just put her in a quiet room to help her calm down so she wouldn't embarrass herself. We love our daughter." "I didn't even know there were peanuts in the tart," Edina suddenly blurted out, her voice shrill with self-preservation. She aggressively distanced herself from the sinking ship. "I just thought the color looked better. Nobody ever tells me anything important." I sat perfectly still, observing their frantic, pathetic attempts to dodge accountability. 5 days ago, this coordinated psychological assault would have shattered me. I would have internalized their lies and questioned my own sanity. Now, it just looked incredibly sad. Ralph slammed his hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward the mayor. "Let me make this crystal clear. If you allow this mentally unstable girl to dictate the terms of our professional relationship, I will personally pull every single dime of my funding from your re-election campaign. I will completely bury that waterfront project. You need my money." It was the most fatal mistake he could have possibly made. Ralph's supreme arrogance had finally blinded him to his actual surroundings. You do not aggressively threaten a sitting politician in a room filled with legal counsel and documented evidence of a potential felony. The mayor stood up slowly, carefully buttoning his suit jacket. His expression was a masterclass in political distancing. He looked at Ralph as if the man were covered in a highly contagious disease. "Mr. Langford," the mayor said, his voice dripping with freezing, professional contempt. "I do not respond well to threats. And I absolutely do not do business with individuals who handle medical emergencies by hiding the victim in a closet to protect my schedule. As of this exact moment, the waterfront development project is officially suspended, pending a full ethical review." Ralph's mouth opened, but absolutely no sound came out. The blood completely drained from his face as the reality of his own catastrophic hubris finally hit him. He had cornered himself. With Ralph temporarily paralyzed by the mayor's devastating rejection, I smoothly initiated the final, most critical phase of the operation. I did not give them a single moment to recover their breath. "Please turn to tab 3, I instructed quietly. The mayor paused at the door, his curiosity clearly outweighing his immediate desire to flee the radioactive room. He opened the binder again. "You will find the complete, original text of the irrevocable trust established by Jacintha Langford," I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence. "And beneath that, you will find 10 years of certified financial audits. They clearly document Ralph and Aboli Langford systematically embezzling hundreds of thousands of dollars from the charitable foundation to illegally prop up Ralph's failing commercial real estate ventures." Aboli's fake sobbing stopped instantly. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with genuine, unadulterated terror. Ralph physically staggered backward, his knees hitting the edge of his expensive leather chair. The secret they had aggressively hidden for a decade, the secret they had used my blind, exhausted signatures to bury, was now sitting in broad daylight. Pursuant to the Beneficiary Protection Clause located on page 42. "Mr. Garrick interjected, his legal voice slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. The trustees' gross financial misconduct, combined with their documented, life-threatening negligence regarding Alwyn's medical emergency, triggers an immediate and permanent forfeiture of their administrative authority. I looked directly into Ralph's panicked, wide eyes. For the first time in my entire life, I was not looking up at him. I was looking completely down. I am formally activating the safety clause, I declared, every single syllable dropping like a heavy iron vault door locking into place. Ralph and Aboli, you are permanently removed as trustees of this foundation. Effective immediately, I have absolute legal and financial control over the entire principal asset. You no longer have access to the banking portals, the vendor accounts, or the political connections. The charity is officially mine. You cannot do this to us, Abali shrieked, finally dropping the elegant socialite mask, her face twisting into pure, ugly desperation. We built this family. You are destroying us over a simple misunderstanding. I didn't destroy anything, Aboli, I replied calmly, finally using her first name to completely sever the emotional tie. I am simply holding up a mirror. You destroyed it all by yourselves. The mayor did not say another word. He firmly closed the black binder, tucked it securely under his arm as evidence, and walked briskly out of the glass doors, his chief of staff hurrying closely behind. In less than 20 minutes, Ralph had lost his most critical political alliance, his massive real estate project, and his entire illegal funding source. I stood up, slowly buttoning my jacket. I did not stay to watch them scream. I walked out of the mahogany boardroom, leaving them trapped in the rubble of their own making. They had absolutely nothing left. Ralph did not surrender quietly. A man who had spent 3 decades aggressively bullying local politicians and crushing small contractors was never going to simply walk away from a multi-million-dollar cash cow. He operated entirely on the arrogant assumption that money and intimidation could legally erase any objective reality. Exactly 3 days after the disastrous boardroom meeting, he launched his final, desperate offensive. I was sitting in Mr. Garrick's quiet, oak-paneled office when the courier arrived with the emergency legal injunction. It was a massive, 40-page document drafted by one of the most notoriously aggressive, high-priced litigation firms in Chicago. Ralph was not just threatening to sue me for the theft of the foundation's assets. He had formally petitioned the state court for an emergency competency hearing, demanding an immediate psychiatric hold. He was legally attempting to declare me mentally unfit to govern my own inheritance, leaning heavily into Aboli's fabricated social media narrative about my supposed psychological breakdown. The document was filled with terrifying legal threats, demanding the immediate freezing of all trust assets until a court-appointed guardian could take over. Mr. Garrick calmly adjusted his reading glasses and scanned the aggressive legal jargon. He did not look worried. He looked mildly amused. They are attempting a classic shock and awe tactic. They want to paralyze you with the sheer volume of legal threats so you surrender before stepping into a courtroom. The old Alwyn would have suffered a debilitating panic attack right there in the leather chair. She would have assumed that expensive lawyers automatically meant absolute defeat. But the new Alwyn understood the fundamental weakness of their strategy. They were building a massive legal case completely upon a foundation of easily disprovable lies. I looked at Mr. Garrick, my pulse completely steady. Do we engage in a long legal battle? Absolutely not, Mr. Garrick replied, turning to his computer keyboard. We do not legitimize a frivolous lawsuit by fighting it in a courtroom. We simply inform opposing counsel that their client is a profound criminal liability. With my formal authorization, Mr. Garrick drafted exactly one brief, highly clinical email to the lead partner of Ralph's expensive litigation firm. He did not argue about my mental state. He simply attached 2 specific files, the certified medical report from Dr. Leonard detailing my near-fatal asphyxiation, and the raw, unedited security camera footage of Ralph shoving me into the dark storage room. The accompanying text was incredibly precise. It stated that if the competency petition was not immediately withdrawn within 2 hours, we would formally submit the attached evidence to the district attorney for criminal charges of reckless endangerment and involuntary manslaughter, followed immediately by a comprehensive FBI report regarding the documented financial embezzlement. We pressed send. We sat in silence and waited. It took exactly 47 minutes for the response to arrive. Ralph's incredibly expensive legal team formally withdrew the emergency petition and officially notified us that they were dropping Ralph as a client due to an irreconcilable conflict of interest. Elite corporate lawyers do not risk their own licenses to protect a man actively facing felony negligence charges. His final weapon broke. The complete collapse of a fraudulent empire does not usually happen in a single, cinematic explosion. It happens in a rapid, humiliating series of canceled contracts, ignored phone calls, and aggressively closed doors. Once the absolute certainty of my financial blockade became public knowledge within their elite circles, Ralph and Aboli's carefully curated reality simply dissolved. Ralph's catastrophic downfall was primarily financial. The mayor's immediate and highly publicized withdrawal from the waterfront development project sent a massive shockwave through the local banking sector. Without the political backing, and completely cut off from the trust fund capital he had been illegally siphoning, his commercial loans were immediately called in. To avoid total bankruptcy, he was forced to rapidly liquidate his most prized commercial properties at a severe loss. He tried to call his powerful golfing buddies for emergency bridge loans, but his calls went entirely straight to voicemail. Aboli's destruction was entirely social, which, for her, was a fate far worse than simple bankruptcy. The Lake Forest High Society operates on a strict, unspoken code of optics. Once the rumors of the aborted competency hearing and the alleged financial irregularities began to circulate, she became a massive social liability. When she attempted to attend her regular Tuesday charity luncheon at the country club, the committee chairwoman politely but firmly asked her to leave the dining room, citing a sudden discrepancy in her membership standing. She was permanently exiled from the only world she actually valued. Adina faced a much quieter, deeply personal reckoning. Dr. Leonard did not offer her a dramatic, screaming breakup. He simply packed his few belongings from her luxury apartment while she was out getting her nails done. He left a brief, handwritten note on the kitchen counter. Leonard later told me exactly what he had written. He stated that as an emergency physician, his entire life was dedicated to preserving human life. He could not, under any circumstances, align himself with a woman who prioritized the aesthetic color of a dessert over the physical safety of her own daughter, and who stood idly by while her sister suffocated in a hallway. He explicitly told her that she did not need a boyfriend. She desperately needed a moral compass. Adina attempted to launch a frantic, tearful social media campaign, claiming she was the tragic victim of a cruel, unexpected abandonment. But her engagement metrics had already plummeted. Without my invisible, constant labor generating her content, managing her sponsors, and polishing her image, the digital world simply scrolled past her. They had spent their entire lives treating everyone around them as disposable resources. They genuinely believed their manufactured prestige made them permanently untouchable. They never realized that prestige is incredibly fragile when it is entirely funded by stolen money and maintained by abused, silent labor. Once I simply stepped out of the operational machinery, gravity took over. I did not aggressively tear down their walls. I just stopped holding the heavy ceiling up. The empire was finally dust. 6 months after the disastrous charity gala, the morning sunlight filtered softly through the large windows of my new apartment. I stood in my kitchen, holding a warm ceramic mug of freshly brewed coffee, simply listening to the profound, beautiful silence. There was absolutely no frantic buzzing from a cell phone demanding unpaid vendor negotiations. There was no overwhelming sense of dread tightening my chest. The air was perfectly clean, entirely free of smoke, stress, and manipulation. My healing process did not happen overnight. The psychological trauma of realizing your own family views you as completely disposable requires intensive, deliberate untangling. I continued my weekly sessions with Dr. Foster, slowly unlearning the toxic instinct to apologize for my own basic existence. I learned how to recognize the physical signs of a trauma response, and I finally stopped treating my own rest as a punishable moral failure. The financial transition of the empire was incredibly smooth and legally bulletproof. Working closely with Mr. Garrick, I successfully removed the foundation from Ralph and Aboli's contaminated history. We transferred the massive principle of Jacintha's irrevocable trust to a highly respected, independent nonprofit organization specializing in pediatric medical research. I stepped down from all administrative duties, ensuring that my grandmother's true philanthropic legacy would finally be honored properly, managed by ethical professionals instead of vain socialites. With my legal and ethical obligations fully resolved, I finally focused entirely on my own future. I officially registered my own independent event management firm. I no longer hid in windowless back offices doing the invisible labor for someone else's glory. I signed my first major corporate client just 3 months into the venture. When I drafted the initial contract, I stared at the billing section for a long time. For 26 years, Ralph had aggressively conditioned me to believe that asking for money was an insult to family duty. My fingers trembled slightly as I typed out my standard, professional hourly rate, but I hit send. The client paid the required deposit the very next morning without a single complaint or negotiation. Seeing that bank transfer clear was an incredibly profound moment of validation. It was objective, financial proof that my skills, my time, and my mind had genuine, undeniable value in the real world. I was no longer a silent workhorse begging for scraps of affection. I was a competent, highly skilled professional running a profitable business. I bought new plants for my windowsill. I started reading books for pleasure instead of auditing legal documents at midnight. I occasionally met Leonard for lunch, establishing a genuine, supportive friendship built on mutual respect rather than trauma bonding. My days finally belonged entirely to me. I had successfully replaced the crushing weight of their expectations with the quiet, brilliant light of my own autonomy. I finally owned my mornings. Peace, however, does not completely erase the lingering complications of shared biology. 7 months into my absolute blackout, an email slipped past my aggressive spam filters. It was from Adina. The tone was completely different from her usual entitled demands. It was frantic, unpolished, and dripping with genuine desperation. Ralph and Aboli were entirely consumed by their own financial and social ruin, fighting viciously with each other over the remaining scraps of their shattered reputation. Adina, completely abandoned by her wealthy social circle and dumped by Leonard, was suddenly left alone to actually parent her 6-year-old daughter. She was begging for a meeting. She claimed she needed my help organizing Flora's upcoming birthday. The old Alwyn would have instantly rushed back into the burning building, desperate to save the child and secretly hoping to finally win her sister's love. But Dr. Foster had taught me the fundamental difference between genuine compassion and toxic enabling. Forgiveness does not automatically require the immediate restoration of access. I did not ignore the email, because Flora was an innocent child caught in a terrible crossfire. I replied with a strictly formatted, emotionally detached list of non-negotiable conditions. I agreed to meet Edina once a month. The meetings would occur strictly on Saturday mornings, in a highly public, neutral location, a specific playground near my new office. Ralph and Aboli were absolutely forbidden from attending. If they appeared, I would instantly leave and the arrangement would be permanently terminated. I would not plan the birthday party, nor would I provide any financial assistance. I was there solely to ensure Flora had a safe, reliable adult figure in her life. Adina agreed immediately. When I arrived at the park that first Saturday, the physical change in my sister was incredibly stark. The glamorous, polished influencer was completely gone. She looked exhausted, wearing a simple sweater, her posture defeated. She tried to immediately launch into a tearful monologue about how unfair our parents were being to her, seamlessly attempting to cast herself as the primary victim. I held up my hand, stopping her mid-sentence. Adina, I am not your therapist, and I am not your crisis manager. We are not discussing Ralph or Aboli. I am here for Flora. She snapped her mouth shut, her eyes flashing with a brief, familiar spark of annoyance. But she quickly swallowed it. She knew I held all the leverage. A moment later, Flora came running across the bright green astroturf, her face lighting up with genuine joy as she threw her small arms around my waist. I hugged her back tightly, breathing in the scent of sunshine and childhood innocence. I looked over Flora's small shoulder at Adina, who was sitting quietly on the park bench. I would never trust my sister again. The glass was permanently shattered, but I could stand firm in the wreckage, acting as a sturdy, immovable shield for the next generation. I became her safe harbor. If you are listening to this right now, and you find yourself constantly exhausted from carrying the emotional and logistical weight of a family that refuses to carry you, I need you to hear this truth. Shared biology is simply a genetic coincidence. It is not an unconditional, lifetime license for emotional exploitation, financial abuse, or profound neglect. For the vast majority of my life, I genuinely believed that my supreme value as a human being was entirely dependent on my extreme utility. I thought that if I just worked a little harder, sacrificed a little more of my own sanity, and absorbed a little more of their cruel criticism, I would eventually earn my rightful place inside their gilded circle. I allowed them to normalize my suffering until they were willing to comfortably leave me gasping for air in a dark storage room simply to protect an applause line. I had to learn the hardest lesson imaginable. You absolutely cannot heal in the exact same toxic environment that is deliberately keeping you sick. Setting a boundary against your own family feels incredibly unnatural at first. The guilt they have systematically programmed into your mind will scream at you, telling you that you are being selfish, cruel, and dramatic. The smear campaigns will inevitably follow. They will desperately try to rewrite the narrative, painting themselves as the tragic victims of your sudden, inexplicable betrayal. Let them talk. Let them spin their elaborate, desperate fictions. The truth does not require a massive public relations budget. The truth only requires a quiet, unwavering commitment to your own objective reality. I did not enact a loud, violent revenge against Ralph, Abelai, and Adina. I simply withdrew my invisible labor, collected the objective paperwork, and allowed the natural, inevitable consequences of their own spectacular arrogance to crush them. The most incredibly satisfying form of retaliation is not making your abusers actively suffer. It is building a life so entirely healthy, so incredibly peaceful, and so fundamentally secure that their toxic control simply has absolutely no environment left to survive in. I look around my quiet apartment today, surrounded by thriving plants and the profound peace of a life I built entirely with my own two hands. I honor my grandmother not by serving the vain empire she accidentally funded, but by fiercely protecting the autonomy she tried to grant me. Legacy isn't what you inherit, it's what you protect. So, tell me honestly, when keeping the fragile peace requires you to remain completely silent about the profound harm being done to your own soul, will you continue desperately protecting the family's hollow image? Or will you finally stand up and begin protecting yourself? If this story resonated with your own quiet struggles, please consider sharing it with someone who might desperately need to hear that walking away is not a failure, but a profound victory. Protect your own peace today.